British war hero. The other, Princess Sophie, willingly bound her royal blood to Hitler's SS elite. This is the chilling reality of Prince Philip's Nazi sister. How could the exact same dynasty breed both a defender of freedom and a bride of fascism? The answer to that dark paradox lies in the ashes of a deeply traumatized childhood. Born in 1914 into the glittering network of European royalty, Sophie carried the prestigious bloodlines of Queen Victoria and the Romanovs. Yet royal titles offered no shield against bullets or revolutions. By the time she was a young girl, the Greek royal family was violently deposed, forced to flee for their lives in a British cruiser. This sudden, brutal exile completely shattered their security. The psychological toll of this downfall was devastating. Her mother, Princess Alice, suffered a severe mental breakdown and was forcibly institutionalized. Crucially, her father, Prince Andrew, essentially abandoned his children, retreating to the French Riviera for a life of aimless distraction. This profound parental coldness left Sophie and her sisters entirely adrift across a hostile Europe. For a fiercely proud young woman, this sudden instability bred a desperate need for order. She sought an impenetrable fortress to guarantee she would never be forced to run for her life again. That fortress presented itself in the form of Germany in the early 1930s. As the Weimar Republic crumbled and the chaotic streets of Berlin were consumed by political violence, the old German aristocracy looked for a savior to restore their lost prestige and enforce brutal national discipline. It was in this volatile crucible that 16-year-old Sophie married Prince Christoph of Hesse in 1930. Christoph was a highly ambitious, deeply committed ideologue who saw the future of Germany in the terrifying rhetoric of the National Socialist Party. He officially joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and, more alarmingly, entered the ranks of the SS in 1932, well before Adolf Hitler formally seized absolute control of the state. For Sophie, this marriage represented a calculated ascent back into relevance. The Nazi apparatus, with its absolute certainties and violent enforcement of order, offered the stability her fractured childhood lacked. Christoph quickly rose to the rank of SS Oberfuhrer, a senior brigade commander, and became a crucial player in the regime's intelligence network. Working directly under Hermann Göring, he was appointed director of the Forschungsamt, a highly secretive and powerful intelligence agency responsible for wiretapping, surveillance, and political espionage. Sophie was no longer a stateless, impoverished princess. She was the wife of a top-tier Nazi intelligence chief, living in opulent palaces protected by armed SS guards, thoroughly insulated from the suffering the regime was already inflicting upon its enemies. The seduction of power swiftly eroded any moral reservations Sophie might have harbored. She actively participated in the social and political elite of the Third Reich alongside her husband. Through Christoph's vital connection to Hermann Göring, the couple was granted extraordinary access to the inner circle of the Nazi leadership. The most chilling manifestation of this access occurred between 1931 and 1932, when Sophie and Christoph were invited to dine privately and share tea with Adolf Hitler at his personal residence. In the intimate setting of a private dining room, stripped of the roaring crowds and massive swastika banners, Sophie found herself captivated. In her own later private memoirs, she made a devastating admission, writing that she and her husband were thoroughly deceived by Hitler's charm and his apparent modesty. She saw a man who spoke quietly of restoring Germany's dignity, blinding herself to the violent anti-Semitism and dictatorial brutality that formed the core of his ideology. This proximity to absolute evil culminated on April 10th, 1935, at the spectacularly lavish wedding of Hermann Goering to Emmy Sonnemann. Sophie attended as a guest of profound honor. Archival photographs capture the chilling reality. Princess Sophie, radiant and draped in aristocratic finery, sat directly across the table from Adolf Hitler. She was at the very epicenter of the Nazi machine, willingly sharing a celebratory meal with the men who would soon plunge the entire world into an apocalyptic war. Her commitment to the regime reached a point of no return in 1937. It is one thing to attend state functions out of political necessity. It is entirely another to brand one's own flesh and blood with the mark of a dictator. When Sophie gave birth to her eldest son, she and Christoph made a deliberate, deeply symbolic decision. They named the boy Karl Adolf Andreas of Hesse. The inclusion of the name Adolf was an unmistakable public tribute to the Führer. It was an ultimate declaration of loyalty, a signal to the Nazi elite that the House of Hesse was entirely devoted to the cause. Sophie proudly displayed photographs of her infant son alongside a framed portrait of Hitler, personally autographed by the dictator himself. By 1938, she formalized her ideological alignment by officially joining the NS Frauenschaft, the National Socialist Women's League. She wore the uniform, she attended the rallies, and she leveraged her husband's terrifying authority to secure her family's dominance. She was the living embodiment of how the European aristocracy, driven by a lethal combination of self-preservation and ideological blindness, willingly knelt before fascism. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, a grotesque dichotomy emerged within the fractured Battenberg family. While Sophie was hosting dinners in Nazi-occupied Europe and raising a son named after the Führer, her younger brother Philip was standing on the freezing decks of British warships. Philip had joined the Royal Navy, fighting on the side of the Allies. In the Mediterranean, during the Battle of Cape Matapan, Philip controlled the searchlights on the HMS Valiant, illuminating fascist naval vessels so British guns could tear them apart in the dark. Brother and sister were locked in a literal war of annihilation, separated by the English Channel and an insurmountable ideological abyss. Philip was risking his life to dismantle the very regime that his sister had built her entire existence upon. This was the brutal reality of their royal bloodline, a family entirely cannibalized by the Second World War, fighting for their lives on opposite sides of history. However, the intoxicating illusion of Nazi invincibility began to shatter following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad. The tide of the war turned, and the absolute power that Christoph and Sophie had enjoyed began to rot from the inside. As a high-ranking intelligence officer, Christoph possessed access to raw, unvarnished data about the state of the war. He saw the mounting casualties, the crumbling infrastructure, and the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. Historical evidence suggests that he became increasingly disillusioned with Hitler's erratic leadership and the unwinnable nature of a two-front war. In the paranoid, hyper-surveilled environment of Nazi Germany, doubt was a death sentence. On October 7, 1943, Christoph's aircraft crashed under highly mysterious circumstances in the Apennine Mountains of Italy. Officially, it was recorded as a tragic wartime aviation accident. However, within the paranoid whispers of the surviving aristocracy, rumors circulated that Christoph might have been eliminated by the Gestapo. While some historical accounts suggest assassination theories, The mere existence of such rumors instantly dissolved the protective fortress Sophie had built. In an instant, the protective fortress Sophie had sacrificed her morality to build was reduced to ash. She was left stranded in a collapsing empire, a widow with 5 young children, bearing the title of an SS Oberfuhrer's wife and the mother of a boy named after a dictator who was rapidly becoming the most hated man on earth. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a graveyard, and the surviving members of the Nazi elite faced the wrath of the victorious Allies. Sophie found herself living in a shattered Germany, stripped of her privileges, facing the horrific revelations of the concentration camps and the Holocaust. The regime she had supported, the men she had dined with, were exposed as the architects of industrial-scale genocide. But the most profound punishment Sophie faced was not dealt by a military tribunal. It was dealt by her own family. In 1947, London was preparing for a moment of national renewal, the grand royal wedding of Prince Philip to Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen of England. It was a massive state occasion designed to lift the spirits of a battered, post-war Britain. King George VI, the British government, and Philip himself understood the volatile optics of the situation. The wounds of the Blitz were still raw. The British public had bled for 6 years to defeat Nazi Germany. Under no circumstances could the sisters of the groom, women who had married high-ranking SS officers and socialized with Hitler, be seen inside Westminster Abbey or on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The decree from London was absolute and unforgiving. Sophie, along with her 2 surviving sisters, who had also married into the German aristocracy, were entirely banned from the royal wedding. They were uninvited, erased from the guest list, and instructed to remain out of sight. As Philip stood at the altar, securing his place at the apex of global royalty, his sister remained entirely isolated, a ghost of a toxic past the British monarchy was desperate to bury. Faced with this brutal rejection, Sophie had a choice. She could have publicly denounced her past, written memoirs begging for forgiveness, or exposed the intricate political survival tactics of the German aristocracy to salvage her own name. Instead, she chose the absolute silence of the defeated. She understood that there was no defense for naming a child Adolf in 1937, no justification for smiling across a dinner table at the man who ordered the eradication of millions. She accepted her exile because she knew she had earned it. Sophie lived for many decades after the war, eventually remarrying Prince George William of Hanover. She settled into a quiet, heavily guarded obscurity in Munich, entirely divorced from the glittering, highly public life of her brother in London. Over the years, behind heavily closed doors, Philip quietly re-established contact with his sisters, visiting them privately and fulfilling his familial duties away from the flashing cameras of the British press. But in the eyes of history and the public, the chasm was never bridged. Sophie remained the Nazi sister, a permanent stain on the impeccable narrative of the modern British monarchy. Her life serves as a terrifying testament to the fragility of human morality when confronted with the desperation of exile and the intoxicating allure of absolute power. She was not a tragic victim swept away by a storm she could not comprehend. She was a highly educated, aristocratic woman who looked directly into the abyss, saw a path to security, and willingly walked into the dark. The ultimate cost of her survival was her legacy, transforming a princess of the blood royal into a footnote of fascist complicity. As history closes its books on Sophie's quiet death in 2001, her story leaves behind a chilling resonance about the choices made in the pursuit of power. Sophie's descent into the fascist orbit was not an isolated family anomaly. Her sisters, Cecilia and Margarita, also married into the German aristocracy, tethering their fates to the Third Reich. While her sisters navigated their own wartime tragedies and shifting loyalties, Sophie remained entrenched in the collapsing Nazi hierarchy, facing a devastating reckoning of her own. The briefcase beneath the heavy oak table at the Wolf's Lair did not kill Adolf Hitler on the blistering afternoon of July 20th, 1944, but the shockwave of that failed detonation ripped through the remaining foundations of the German aristocracy with absolute, merciless precision. Operation Valkyrie was the desperate, 11th-hour gamble by the traditional military elite to assassinate the dictator, sever the Nazi apparatus, and sue for a negotiated peace before the Allied armies completely obliterated the nation. When the smoke cleared and Hitler's voice, trembling with paranoid rage, crackled over the state radio to announce his survival, the gates of hell were thrown wide open for anyone connected to the old nobility. The Nazi regime, always deeply suspicious of the aristocratic class that had initially helped legitimize it, abandoned any remaining pretense of civility. The Gestapo was unleashed. Heinrich Himmler initiated a ruthless purge, a campaign of vengeance that sought to exterminate not only the conspirators, but their entire bloodlines. It was in this claustrophobic, blood-soaked atmosphere that Princess Margarita, the eldest sister of Prince Philip, found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own class's making. Her husband, Gottfried of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, who had returned from the butchery of the Eastern Front, a broken and entirely disillusioned man, was deeply implicated in the fringes of the resistance network. The men who had plotted to kill Hitler were his peers, his former commanding officers, the very men who shared his aristocratic pedigree. When the Gestapo dragnet swept across Germany, it inevitably closed its jaws around Langenburg Castle. The men in black leather coats arrived with absolute authority, tearing through the estate, interrogating the staff, and placing Gottfried under severe hostile scrutiny. He was stripped of the remaining shreds of his military dignity and formally dismissed from the armed forces under the shadow of high treason. For Margarita, the terror was no longer an abstract concept delivered via military telegrams. It was standing in the foyer of her home. The Nazi state invoked the draconian medieval concept of Sippenhaft, or kin liability. This terrifying decree meant that if a man was found guilty of treason against the Führer, his guilt was automatically transferred to his wife, his children, and his extended relatives. Entire families of the conspirators were being rounded up, their children thrown into orphanages under false names. The parents sent to the executioner's block at Plötzensee prison to be hanged from meat hooks. Margarita was forced to live every single hour with the suffocating knowledge that one wrong word, one piece of fabricated evidence wrung from a tortured officer in a Berlin basement, would result in the immediate arrest of herself and her children. The aristocratic titles that these women had so desperately relied upon to secure their safety had suddenly mutated into death warrants. The regime they had tolerated, and in some cases actively supported, had turned entirely cannibalistic. While Margarita was fighting a silent psychological war for her family's survival against the Gestapo, her younger sister Sophie was enduring an equally horrifying collapse of her reality. Following the mysterious and highly suspicious death of her husband Christoph in the plane crash of 1943, Sophie was a profoundly isolated figure. The protective armor of being an SS Oberfuhrer's wife had vanished, leaving her highly exposed. She retreated to the sprawling Friedrichshof Castle, the magnificent family estate built by Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, seeking sanctuary behind its massive stone walls. But there was no sanctuary left in Germany. The Allied bombing campaigns had escalated from strategic strikes to total apocalyptic destruction. The sky above the Hesse estates was a permanent bruised purple, choked with the smoke of burning cities. At night, the droning hum of hundreds of Allied heavy bombers vibrated through the floorboards. Sophie, once the glittering guest of honor at Hermann Göring's wedding table, was reduced to huddling in damp, freezing cellars with her 5 young children, covering their ears as the concussions of high-explosive ordnance shattered the centuries-old stained glass windows above them. The profound irony of Sophie's situation during the winter of 1944 was terrifying in its absolute clarity. In 1937, she had named her firstborn son Karl Adolf, a deliberate, highly public tribute to the man she believed would secure her family's supremacy for 1,000 years. Now, with the regime rapidly collapsing and the Gestapo hunting down the aristocracy, that name offered absolutely zero protection from the wrath of the Nazi state. Worse still, as the booming artillery of the advancing American forces grew louder in the West, she realized with sickening certainty that the name would soon become a massive, potentially lethal liability. She was raising a child named after the very dictator the advancing armies were bleeding to destroy. She was trapped in the agonizing paradox of her own political choices. The survival strategy that had defined her youth, marrying into fascist power to escape the poverty of exile, had brought the war directly to her doorstep. Half a world away, the youngest child of the Battenberg family was living an entirely different reality, entirely detached from the freezing, starving collapse of his sister's world. Prince Philip was deployed to the Pacific Theater aboard the HMS Whelp, a British fleet destroyer. While his sisters were burying their family silver in the frozen mud to hide it from advancing armies, Philip was standing on the bridge of a warship, cutting through the vast, sunlit expanse of the ocean. He was part of a massive, unstoppable Allied war machine that was systematically dismantling the Axis powers. More importantly, his future was solidifying with absolute certainty. Letters from Princess Elizabeth found their way to his ship, bridging the immense distance with a steady, quiet promise of stability. Philip was securing his place within the bedrock of the British establishment. He was fighting on the side of righteous victory, his hands entirely clean of the political filth that was drowning his family in Europe. The contrast was brutal. Philip was rising toward the sun, while his sisters were rapidly sinking into the ashes of a destroyed empire. When the spring of 1945 finally broke, it brought the total catastrophic annihilation of the Third Reich. The Soviet Red Army clawed its way into the ruins of Berlin, fighting street by street in a merciless campaign of retribution, while the American and British forces crossed the Rhine, pushing deep into the German heartland. The state apparatus evaporated. The SS guards, who had once snapped to attention when Sophie entered a room, stripped off their black uniforms, burning them in ditches and stealing civilian clothes in a desperate bid to melt into the terrified populace. The swastika banners that had draped the balconies of the Hesse palaces were torn down and trampled into the dirt. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler fired a bullet into his own head in a subterranean bunker, and the 1,000-year Reich ceased to exist. The sudden silence that fell over Europe in May 1945 was not a peaceful one. It was the deafening, shell-shocked silence of a continent staring into an abyss. For Margarita and Sophie, the end of the war did not bring liberation. It brought an immediate, brutal reckoning. The American military forces rolled into Kronberg, their tanks chewing up the manicured lawns of the Friedrichshof estate. The castle, with its sprawling rooms and strategic location, was immediately requisitioned by the U.S. Army to serve as an officers' club. Sophie, the Princess of Greece and Denmark, the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was unceremoniously evicted from her own home. She was forced to pack what little she could carry and relocate to a small, cramped cottage on the estate grounds. She watched from the windows as American soldiers, chewing gum and smoking Lucky Strikes, swaggered through the opulent halls where she had once entertained the highest echelons of the Nazi elite. The immediate post-war period was an era of starvation, humiliation, and intense vulnerability. The sisters were suddenly citizens of a conquered, occupied territory, subjected to the strict curfews and rationing of the Allied military government. They had to stand in lines for basic foodstuffs, their aristocratic titles entirely meaningless to the American GIs who handed out powdered milk and canned meat. But the physical deprivations were secondary to the massive, looming, psychological dread that now consumed them. They had survived the bombs, they had survived the Gestapo, and they had survived the collapse of the state. But they now had to face a far more terrifying tribunal, the judgment of the world and the judgment of their own brother. The Allied denazification tribunals began their exhaustive work, dragging thousands of Germans before panels to account for their actions during the 12 years of fascist rule. The sisters' lives were laid bare. The photographs of Sophie at Göring's wedding, the records of her membership in the Nazi Women's League, the unassailable fact of her late husband's rank as an SS Oberfuhrer, all of it was suddenly matters of public, international record. They could no longer hide behind the excuse of ignorance. The liberation of the concentration camps broadcast the horrific mechanized reality of the Holocaust to the entire globe. The world saw the mountains of corpses, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the world knew that the men who had built that machinery were the very men the Battenberg sisters had invited to dinner. As the postal system slowly began to function again in late 1945, the physical separation between the siblings ended, but the emotional chasm became insurmountable. Philip returned to England a decorated war hero, his path to marrying the future Queen of England clear and unobstructed. But the British public, entirely traumatized by the Blitz and the loss of hundreds of thousands of men, harbored a deep, violent hatred for anything German. The political advisors at Buckingham Palace looked at Philip's pedigree and saw a massive, highly explosive vulnerability. He was a brilliant naval officer, yes, but he was also a man whose brothers-in-law had worn the swastika. The letters that finally crossed the channel between Philip and his sisters were fraught with a terrible unspoken tension. How does a victorious Allied officer speak to a sister who named her child after the man who ordered the bombing of London? How does a woman whose husband was a general in the enemy army ask her brother for financial help because she is freezing in a requisitioned cottage? The war had fundamentally broken the language of their family. They were no longer simply siblings. They were representatives of the victor and the vanquished, separated by an ocean of blood. Sophie and Margarita realized that the survival they had fought so viciously for came at the ultimate price. They were alive, but they were entirely radioactive. They were pariahs in their own country, defeated enemies to the occupying forces, and severe political liabilities to their only brother. The fortress they had built out of Nazi promises had collapsed, leaving them entirely exposed in the ruins, waiting for a royal decree from London that would confirm their absolute exile. The absolute ruin of the House of Hesse was not merely political, it was about to become profoundly, devastatingly physical. When the American forces requisitioned Friedrichshof Castle in April 1945, transforming the magnificent estate into an officers' club for the victorious military brass, Sophie and her extended family were relegated to the cramped, freezing servant cottages on the perimeter of the grounds. They were stripped of their dignity, their political power, and their freedom of movement. But there was one final desperate safety net they believed they had secured. Before the Allied tanks had rolled into Kronberg, anticipating the utter collapse of the German economy and the potential looting of their ancestral home, the Hesse family had meticulously gathered their most irreplaceable assets. They took the legendary Hesse crown jewels, a breathtaking centuries-old collection of diamonds, rubies, emeralds, solid gold tiaras, and priceless jade, and placed them inside a zinc-lined wooden box. Under the cover of darkness, they buried this box deep beneath the floor of the castle's subterranean wine cellar, sealing the stone masonry above it to hide any trace of the excavation. This buried treasure was not just a collection of pretty heirlooms. For a family whose bank accounts were frozen by the occupying authorities and whose political currency was less than zero, those jewels represented their literal survival. They were the only means by which Sophie, now a widowed mother of 5, could guarantee that her children would not starve in a post-war Germany where currency was practically worthless and the black market operated on a barter system. The jewels were their insurance policy against total destitution. However, the arrogance of the conquered is often matched only by the entitlement of the conqueror. In November 1945, Captain Kathleen Nash, an American military officer stationed at the castle, was exploring the dark, cavernous cellars with Colonel Jack Durant. Noticing a patch of newly laid concrete that did not match the surrounding ancient stonework, they ordered the floor to be broken open. Beneath the rubble, they found the zinc-lined box. When they pried it open, they did not report the finding to the Allied military command. Instead, they stared at millions of dollars worth of royal treasure and decided to take it for themselves. In a brazen act of looting, Nash, Durant, and a third accomplice, Major David Watson, systematically dismantled the collection. They popped priceless diamonds out of their antique settings, dumped the loose stones into unassuming duffel bags, and smuggled the looted fortune out of Germany and across the Atlantic to the United States. For months, the Hesse family remained entirely unaware that their future had been hollowed out. It was not until April 1946, when a family member requested access to the cellar to retrieve a specific piece of jewelry for a wedding, that the catastrophic theft was discovered. They found the hole in the ground, the shattered concrete, and the empty box. The psychological blow to Sophie and her relatives was staggering. The very people who had defeated them, the military force that represented the righteous democratic victory over fascist tyranny, had robbed them blind in their own basement. The family was forced to swallow their remaining pride and report the theft to the American military police, begging the occupying army to hunt down its own rogue officers. The subsequent investigation and highly publicized court-martial of the American officers in Frankfurt became an international sensation. It exposed the sordid, chaotic reality of the post-war occupation. But for Sophie, the trial was a source of deep, agonizing humiliation. It dragged the House of Hesse back into the unforgiving spotlight of the global press. Newspapers around the world detailed the staggering wealth of the German aristocrats, painting them not as victims of a crime, but as hordes of fascist sympathizers who were finally getting what they deserved. The public had no sympathy for a family that had dined with Hitler and commanded SS brigades. While some of the loose stones were eventually recovered years later, the collection was permanently mutilated, and a vast portion of their wealth was gone forever. Sophie was left entirely dependent on the meager rations allocated to her. Watching her children wear threadbare clothes in the shadow of the castle she used to command. This crushing poverty and daily humiliation stood in violent, almost unbelievable contrast to the life her brother was building across the English Channel. In London, Prince Philip was stepping out of the shadows of his chaotic, fragmented childhood and walking directly into the blinding light of the British establishment. The war had proven his loyalty, his bravery, and his absolute commitment to the crown. But to marry Princess Elizabeth, the heir presumptive to the largest empire on earth, Philip had to undergo a radical systemic cleansing of his past. The British government and the royal advisors, acutely aware of the deep-seated anti-German sentiment that saturated the British public, looked at Philip's family tree with profound terror. They saw a minefield of swastikas and SS insignias. To sanitize his image, Philip was required to systematically strip away every remaining connection to his continental roots. In February 1947, he formally renounced his right to the Greek and Danish thrones. He discarded his royal titles, choosing to become a naturalized British subject. He needed a surname that sounded reassuringly English, something that would not remind the public of the bombs that had rained down on Coventry and London. He adopted the surname Mountbatten, an anglicized version of his mother's family name, Battenberg, which had been shrewdly changed during the anti-German hysteria of the First World War. He was no longer Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. He was Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a clean, heroic, thoroughly British naval officer. But changing a name on a piece of paper could not erase the existence of his 3 surviving sisters living in the ruins of Germany. As the planning for the monumental royal wedding in November 1947 accelerated, a brutal political calculus was applied behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace. King George VI, a man who had stayed in London while the Luftwaffe pulverized his capital, knew the mood of his people. The British public was enduring severe post-war rationing. They were tired, grieving, and entirely intolerant of anything associated with the regime that had caused their suffering. The idea of inviting German royalty to Westminster Abbey, particularly women who were widows of high-ranking Nazi officers, was not just politically risky, it was entirely impossible. It would have caused a national outrage, potentially destabilizing the monarchy at a time when it desperately needed to project unity and strength. The decision was finalized. There would be no compromises, no quiet side doors, no private family pews. Margarita, Theodora, and Sophie were officially banned from attending their brother's wedding. When the news was delivered to the sisters in Germany, it arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the cold, bureaucratic silence of the British state. They simply did not receive invitations. For Sophie, who had spent her entire youth trying to hold her shattered family together after their exile from Greece, the exclusion was a devastating emotional blow. She had changed Philip's diapers. She had played with him on the beaches of France. She had written him letters throughout his lonely boarding school years. Now, At the defining moment of his life, the moment that secured his legacy and validated the Battenberg bloodline, she was ordered to stay away. She did not rage against the decision. She did not write angry letters to the British press or attempt to justify her past. Sophie possessed a cold, aristocratic pragmatism, and she understood exactly why she was being erased. She looked at her son, Karl Adolf, and she looked at the unmarked grave of her SS husband, and she knew that the bill for her survival strategy had finally come due. She had wagered her moral compass on the invincibility of the Third Reich to protect herself from the terrifying poverty of her youth. She had won a decade of opulent security, but the cost was her absolute permanent exile from the family she loved. She accepted her punishment in silence, watching from a frozen cottage in a conquered country while the radio broadcasted the cheers of millions of Britons celebrating the union of Philip and Elizabeth. As the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across London on November 20th, 1947, Philip stood at the altar, impeccably dressed in his naval uniform, looking toward a future of unparalleled influence and duty. He had survived the curse of his family's exile by completely severing himself from it. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, surrounded by the rubble of a nation she had helped lead into the abyss, Sophie sat beside a crackling radio, listening to the triumph of a brother she was no longer allowed to claim. The separation was absolute, a permanent scar etched into the history of the British monarchy, proving that while blood may be thicker than water, it is not thicker than the devastating judgment of history. The crackling static of the radio broadcast on November 20th, 1947, did not just transmit the cheers of a victorious British public, it broadcast the final undeniable confirmation of Princess Sophie's exile. Sitting in the drafty confines of her requisitioned cottage in Kronberg, surrounded by the physical and economic ruin of a defeated Germany, she listened as the Archbishop of Canterbury united her younger brother with the future Queen of England. Philip, the boy she had once chased across the sunlit beaches of the French Riviera, was now the Duke of Edinburgh. He had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of 20th century history, anchoring himself to the most secure institution on the planet. Sophie, conversely, was entirely marooned. The radio waves carrying the pealing bells of Westminster Abbey underscored a brutal reality. The Battenberg family had survived the collapse of European royalty, but they had done so by splitting their bloodline across an insurmountable ideological divide. The immediate years following the royal wedding were an exercise in endurance. The bitter winter of 1947, one of the coldest on record, froze the rivers of Germany and deepened the misery of a population already starving under Allied rationing. For Sophie, the daily struggle was no longer about political maneuvering or maintaining aristocratic prestige. It was about sheer, unvarnished survival. She was a widowed mother of 5, carrying the toxic legacy of an SS Oberfuhrer husband. Her eldest son, Karl Adolf, bore a name that was a daily vocal reminder of the catastrophic miscalculation she had made. Calling her son from across a room or writing his name on a school registry was a humiliating act, a constant friction against a society that was desperately, almost violently, trying to scrub the stain of National Socialism from its collective memory. Sophie possessed the pragmatic resilience of a woman who had already lost everything once before in Greece. But the psychological weight of the post-war era was entirely different. This was not the romantic exile of a deposed monarch. This was the suffocating isolation of a defeated pariah. The denazification process implemented by the occupying Allied forces cast a long, paralyzing shadow over the remnants of the German aristocracy. The tribunals were designed to systematically root out fascist sympathizers, and the Hesse family was subjected to intense, humiliating scrutiny. Sophie had to account for her membership in the National Socialist Women's League, her presence at elite Nazi functions, and the high-ranking intelligence role of her late husband. While she was not prosecuted as a war criminal, she was ultimately a spouse rather than an architect of the regime's atrocities. The social and financial sanctions were crippling. The grand estates were largely inaccessible. The family wealth had been heavily looted or frozen, and the name she carried was synonymous with the enemy. She was forced to navigate a shattered social landscape where her former peers were either dead, imprisoned, or equally ruined. Yet, the instinct for preservation that had driven her into the arms of the Nazi elite in the 1930s did not abandon her in the ashes of the 1940s. In 1946, amidst the chaos of the occupation, Sophie found a measure of stability. She married Prince George William of Hanover. This union was not the glittering, highly politicized affair of her first marriage to Christoph. It was a quiet, pragmatic alliance forged in the ruins of their shared world. George William was also a member of the deposed German royalty, a man who understood the complex, often contradictory pressures of their class. He offered Sophie a lifeline, a chance to rebuild a semblance of domestic normalcy for her children, away from the glaring epicenter of the Hesse family's disgrace. The marriage provided a buffer, allowing Sophie to slowly step back from the immediate radioactive fallout of her SS associations, even if it could never truly erase them. While Sophie was meticulously trying to piece together a quiet life in Germany, her brother was ascending to the absolute pinnacle of global visibility. In 1952, King George VI died and Elizabeth became queen. Philip was no longer just a naval officer. He was the consort of the sovereign, a man whose every public move was scrutinized by the global press. The coronation in 1953 was a technicolor spectacle of imperial survival, broadcast to millions around the world. Once again, the sisters were absent. The British government remained steadfast in its policy. The German relatives, particularly those with ties to the Third Reich, were to be kept entirely out of the public narrative. The optics of the Cold War had replaced the optics of the Second World War, but the anti-German sentiment in Britain remained a powerful political force. Philip was tasked with modernizing the monarchy, projecting an image of a unified, forward-looking Britain. Acknowledging his sisters, acknowledging the swastikas in his family tree would have provided devastating ammunition to the monarchy's critics. But the absolute public severance masked a deeply complex, highly guarded, private reality. Philip was a man defined by duty, but he was not devoid of familial loyalty. Behind the impenetrable walls of Buckingham Palace and the heavily monitored schedules of state visits, a clandestine effort was underway to bridge the chasm. The siblings had suffered too much collective trauma in their youth to simply let the political boundaries of the post-war world sever them completely. In the 1950s, as the immediate animosity of the war began to cool and the economic miracle of West Germany took hold, Philip began to quietly, unofficially visit his sisters. These reunions were masterclasses in discretion. There were no official motorcades, no press releases, and no public photographs. Philip would travel to Germany under the radar, stepping out of his role as the Duke of Edinburgh to briefly inhabit the role of the youngest Battenberg sibling. The meetings took place behind the high walls of private estates far from the lenses of the paparazzi. For Sophie, these visits were profoundly emotional, yet undoubtedly fraught with an unspoken tension. How do you look at the brother who fought for the army that bombed your home? How do you reconcile the fact that your husband's colleagues would have executed him without hesitation if the war had turned out differently? The siblings did not dwell on the politics of the 1930s or the atrocities of the 1940s. They could not. To fully address the choices Sophie and Margarita had made would have been to detonate a bomb in the middle of their fragile reconciliation. Instead, they focused on the present. They talked about their children, about the eccentricities of their aging mother, Alice, who had survived the war in Athens, sheltering a Jewish family, and had subsequently founded a Greek Orthodox nursing order. They rebuilt their relationship on the narrow, safe ground of blood ties, carefully stepping around the massive historical crater that sat in the center of their family history. This compartmentalization was the only way they could survive the paradox of their existence. Philip compartmentalized his German roots to serve the British Crown, and Sophie compartmentalized her Nazi past to maintain a relationship with her brother. But the past is rarely content to remain buried. As the decades progressed into the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of historians and journalists began to aggressively excavate the history of the Second World War. The archives were opened, the diaries were published, and the extent of the European aristocracy's collaboration with Adolf Hitler was brought back into the merciless light of public scrutiny. The photographs of Sophie sitting across from Hitler at Goering's wedding, the SS personnel files of Christoph of Hesse, the chilling reality of a nephew named Karl Adolf, all of it resurfaced, forcing the British royal family to repeatedly manage the fallout of their German connections. Sophie watched this historical reckoning from the quiet obscurity she had cultivated in Munich. She was no longer the radiant, ambitious princess of the 1930s, nor the terrified, starving widow of the 1940s. She had aged into a stoic, fiercely private matriarch. She refused to give interviews. She did not write defensive memoirs or attempt to publicly justify her actions to a world she knew would never understand the desperate calculus of her youth. She understood that any attempt to explain her proximity to Hitler would be interpreted as an apology for the Holocaust, a burden she was unwilling and unable to shoulder in the public arena. Her silence was not necessarily a sign of unrepentant fascism. Rather, it was the silence of a woman who recognized that her personal truth was entirely incompatible with the established historical record. She had chosen the wrong side. She had gambled her morality for security and had lost spectacularly. There was nothing left to say. Her later years were spent navigating the strange duality of her legacy. On one hand, she was a respected figure within the tight-knit, increasingly irrelevant circles of the surviving European nobility. She attended the private weddings and christenings of her extended family, a living relic of a bygone era. On the other hand, she was a permanent ghost haunting the British monarchy. When Philip and Elizabeth made official state visits to West Germany, the diplomatic protocols required exhaustive planning to ensure that the Queen was never photographed in the presence of her controversial sisters-in-law. The geographical distance had vanished, but the political quarantine remained absolute until the very end. The tragic arc of Princess Sophie forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable realities of survival and ambition. It strips away the gilded romance of royalty and exposes the desperate, sometimes catastrophic choices made when privilege is threatened by annihilation. Sophie was not a monster by nature, but she willingly allied herself with monsters for the illusion of safety. She allowed the allure of the swastika to blind her to the blood it was shedding, and she paid for that blindness with a lifetime of marginalization. As her life drew to a close at the dawn of a new millennium, outliving nearly all the architects of the war that defined her, she stood as a silent monument to the terrifying cost of historical miscalculation. Her brother had become a global icon of duty, his face recognized in every corner of the earth, while she remained a deliberate omission, a shadow carefully cropped out of the family portrait. As the decades marched relentlessly toward the close of the 20th century, the geopolitical landscape of Europe underwent transformations that would have been utterly unimaginable to the young woman who once raised her arm in a fascist salute. The Cold War, which had provided a convenient, frozen distraction from the immediate horrors of the Second World War, began to thaw. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of a fractured, traumatized continent, was torn down by the hands of ordinary citizens. Germany was reunited not through the blood and iron of a dictatorial decree, but through the irresistible democratic will of a new generation. For the vast majority of the world, this was a moment of profound euphoric liberation. But for Princess Sophie of Greece and Denmark, now an elderly woman living quietly in Munich, the reunification of her country must have been an experience layered with an agonizing, silent complexity. She had lived long enough to see the total eradication of the world she was born into, the apocalyptic destruction of the world she had compromised her soul to build, and the eventual rise of a world that viewed her choices with absolute, unvarnished revulsion. To understand the isolation of Sophie's final years, one must look not only at the brother who exiled her, but at the mother who inadvertently shamed her. Princess Alice of Battenberg, the profoundly deaf, psychologically fragile woman who had suffered a devastating mental breakdown during Sophie's childhood, spent the Second World War living in occupied Athens. While Sophie was attending elite Nazi functions in Berlin and dining with the architects of the Holocaust, her mother was actively resisting them. In a display of staggering quiet courage, Princess Alice used her royal residence in Greece to hide a Jewish family, the Cohens, from the Gestapo. She used her deafness as a shield, feigning ignorance when SS officers knocked on her door to interrogate her. She risked immediate execution to save the lives of absolute strangers. Years later, the State of Israel would honor Alice with the title of Righteous Among the Nations, burying her on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. This is the most devastating, irreconcilable contradiction of the Battenberg family. The mother risked her life to defy the very regime that the daughter had embraced. How does a woman live out her twilight years knowing that her own mother possessed the moral clarity and courage that she entirely lacked? Sophie never spoke publicly about Alice's heroism, just as she never spoke about her own complicity. The psychological weight of that contrast must have been suffocating. She had justified her alignment with the Third Reich as a necessary measure for survival, a pragmatic shield against the chaos of her youth. Yet, her mother, a woman who was far more vulnerable, stripped of her wealth, and living in a hostile, occupied city, proved that moral surrender was not the only option. Alice demonstrated that even in the darkest abyss of human history, one could choose the light. Sophie had chosen the armor of the oppressor, and in doing so, she became the permanent antithesis of her mother's enduring grace. As the 1990s progressed, The generation that had actively fought in and survived the Second World War began to die out. The visceral, living memory of the conflict transitioned into the cold, analytical realm of history. Biographers, documentarians, and historians began to meticulously comb through the archives, bringing the uncomfortable truths of the European aristocracy back into the public eye. The British press, always hungry for royal scandal, occasionally resurrected the ghosts of Philip's German sisters. Photographs of Sophie at Hermann Göring's wedding would periodically surface in Sunday tabloids, presented as shocking historical anomalies. But Sophie was no longer a threat. She was a relic. The public outrage had dulled into a morbid curiosity. She was viewed not as an active agent of evil, but as a tragic, cautionary figure. A woman who had bet her life on the wrong horse and spent 60 years paying the tab. Through all of this, the burden of her choices fell heavily upon her children, particularly her eldest son. The boy, who was born in 1937 and christened Karl Adolf Andreas of Hesse, had to navigate the entirety of the late 20th century, carrying the name of the man who had ordered the systematic extermination of millions. It is a profound, often overlooked tragedy of the fascist era, the generational trauma inflicted upon the children of the perpetrators. They were innocent of the crimes, yet they were branded with the legacy. Karl Adolf grew up in a democratic, rapidly modernizing Germany that was actively repenting for its past. Every time he introduced himself, every time he handed over a passport, the ghosts of his parents' allegiance were summoned. The name was a permanent, inescapable tattoo of his family's darkest chapter. Sophie had intended the name to be a masterstroke of political insurance. Instead, it became a lifelong albatross around her son's neck. Despite the intense historical scrutiny, the private relationship between Sophie and her brother Philip matured into a quiet, heavily guarded peace. As they both entered their 80s, the fiery, absolute boundaries of the 1940s softened into the nostalgic, forgiving reality of old age. Philip, now the undisputed patriarch of the British royal family, had achieved everything he set out to do. He had modernized the monarchy, secured the line of succession, and served his adopted country with an ironclad devotion. He no longer needed to aggressively distance himself from his German roots because his British legacy was unassailable. In 1994, Philip traveled to Israel for a profoundly emotional ceremony to plant a tree in honor of his mother at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. It was a moment of absolute global validation for the Battenberg bloodline, a definitive proof that the family was capable of immense good. It is highly probable that Philip's reconciliation with his family's past allowed him to be more present for his last surviving sister. When they met in their final years, they were no longer the decorated Allied officer and the disgraced SS widow. They were just Philip and Sophie, two elderly siblings who had survived the most violent century in human history. They shared a language of loss that no one else on earth could truly understand. They had seen their family exiled, their wealth destroyed, their sisters killed in plane crashes, and their world burned to the ground. They had taken radically different paths through the inferno, but they had both made it to the other side. There is a fragile, heartbreaking beauty in the fact that despite the massive ideological blood feud that defined their youth, they managed to find each other again in the quiet fading of the light. Princess Sophie of Greece and Denmark died on November 24th, 2001, in a nursing home in Munich. She was 87 years old. Her passing did not interrupt regular television broadcasts. There were no state funerals, no flags lowered to half-mast across the capitals of Europe, no thousands of weeping citizens lining the streets. Her death was a quiet, private affair, noted in the obituary columns of a few broadsheet newspapers. She had outlived her first husband, Christoph, by almost 60 years. She had outlived the 1,000-year Reich by over half a century, and she had outlived all of her sisters. Prince Philip traveled to Germany to attend her funeral. It was a solemn, entirely private family gathering, devoid of the military pageantry and state scrutiny that defined his life in London. As he stood by her grave, he was burying the last living link to his childhood, the sister who had carried him in an orange crate aboard a British warship fleeing Greece, the sister who had watched him grow up on the beaches of France, the sister who had broken his heart by embracing the swastika. She was gone. With her death, the deeply fractured, deeply controversial generation of the Battenberg daughters came to a definitive end. The book was finally closed on the Nazi sisters of the British monarchy. Prince Philip and Princess Sophie sprang from the exact same root, yet history forced them into a brutal divergence. One anchored himself to the British crown and became a global icon of duty. The other allied herself with the swastika in a desperate bid for security. As the archives close on Sophie's quiet death in 2001,